Statistics suggest that women constitute about 49% of Nigeria's population. Yet, participation of women in politics has been quite low since the inception of Nigeria's democracy. Over the years, concerted efforts have been made by government and non-governmental organizations to increase the level of participation of women in politics in line with the declaration made at the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing, which advocated 30% affirmative action. The extant national gender policy in Nigeria took it a notch higher by recommending 35% affirmative action while seeking more inclusive representation of women with at least 35% of both appointments and elective positions. These efforts have so far yielded little results as women participation in politics is still far from the desired numbers. In the 9th National Assembly, there are only 7 women in the Senate out of 109 senators, while the House of Representatives has only 13 women out of 360 members. A recent bill in the House of Representatives, which proposes creation of additional seats to be filled by only women in the National Assembly, is the latest effort aimed at increasing female representation. This bill, seeking to alter the 1999 Constitution to create additional special seats for women in the federal and state legislative houses, passed second reading at the House of Representatives plenary session on Wednesday, 28 April 2021. The bill proposes the creation of additional 37 Senate seats, specifically for women, one from each state of the Federation and the FCT. It also proposes the creation of 2 additional seats from each of the 36 states of the Federation and FCT for the House of Representatives, with additional creation of 1 seat from each senatorial district of the 36 states of the Federation to be contested for solely by a woman. This establishes 3 additional state House of Assembly seats, 1 from each of the senatorial districts in the state. The provision is, however, a temporary special measure which will come up for review after 4 election cycles of 16 years. The bill would create a new narrative on the question of female inclusion in Nigeria's politics. What are the issues behind low participation of women in politics? What does the new bill portend for Nigerian women? These and more are the issues to be x-rayed on this edition of Good Morning Nigeria.
CYNTHIA MBAMALU of YIAGA Africa, from your point of view, is there at this time a crying need for increased participation of women in Nigerian legislature? And if so, what is the rationale for this? Is it just mere participation or to improve the quality of legislative transactions?
Thank you and good morning once again. I think it's at the core of democracy itself. So it's not just about mere participation, it's a question of, are we ready to build a democratic, developed society? Because no country can develop if half of its population are not part of the decision-making process. It's like a bird trying to fly with 1 wing. I don't know how far the bird can go. And that is why we're still struggling in Nigeria. So this proposed bill, what it seeks to do basically is to solve the challenge of low representation of women. The Honorable Minister has said it at the federal and state level. It's worrisome that in Nigeria, in 2021, if you look at the 2019 elections that has brought us to where we are currently, at the State Assembly, out of 991 state constituencies, only 44 are women. In the whole of Northwest, only Kaduna has 1 woman in the State Assembly, and that is 7 states in the north, meaning that states like Kano with 40 state legislators have no woman. Now, that is just state level. If you come to the national, it's also poor. If you go to appointment, it is poor. So now the focus on the conversation around creating additional seats is one. It became necessary at this point to respond to the need to take legislative action to open up the space to increase women representation at the legislative arm of government. Why is this important? The legislature is the hub of democracy. That is where laws are made. That is where oversight functions are performed. That is where representation of the people is done in its purest form. Now, what we have currently is a National Assembly that even in lawmaking we do not even see gender-sensitive laws being churned out because we have few voices of women at the national level. So even, for instance, as simple as the response to sexual and gender-based violence, we expect, for instance, the Ministry of Women Affairs or the minister to perform magic. But if we do not have legislative support to back sufficient funding to address issues of sexual and gender-based violence, for instance, then the minister would just be acting and will be fighting a battle that only her is waging the war. So we also need to start thinking that beyond participation, that for the quality of governance, for the quality of leadership, we need women represented in government, so that when we talk about development, we're looking at development from a gender-sensitive lens that addresses the needs of men, women, girls, and boys. It is also worrisome that in a country like Nigeria, over almost 49%, 49.something% are women of our population. However, in the decision-making process, you see is male-dominated. So beyond just representation, beyond quality of governance, is also about image of the society. So when people look at government, it's almost like Nigeria is made up of men and no women, because the government should reflect the society. But what we have is a government that is not truly reflecting the beauty of our society, which is made up of powerful, beautiful, intelligent, capable women and men. And we need to see that reflected in government. So honestly, this bill, what it seeks to do is to solve this challenge first of low representation. Let us open up the space through legislative action, amend the constitution, create additional seats. Since all our efforts in previous assemblies for affirmative action, they have been failing. So let us try this and let us see how it works. By the time we solve this, we'll begin to see governance in its purest form. We begin to see the quality of governance improving to meet the needs of every citizen in Nigeria.
Yeah, let's go back to Cynthia once more. Cynthia, okay, talked about quality of representation and participation. We have so many intelligent women in Nigeria, people like you, but I'm not sure you would like to go into politics because of the rigorous nature of politics in Nigeria. But they're speaking so well about women participation. Now, looking at politics as a rigorous process, from nomination, you have to campaign for nomination, and then vie for election. And one wonders the process this will take to bring the number of women we desire to be in a National Assembly based on the nature of politics itself. One, finance. Dame talked about poverty and what have you. So looking at Nigeria as a nation, do you think that we have such number of women who have the capacity in terms of finance, the capacity in terms of intelligence that will give us a quality representation that we spoke about? Is it a possibility? No, because one is easy to say, look, one such number of women to participate. Another is the process of getting them there.
Yes, that's an interesting question. And I mean, this is a country that produced the first woman to head, from Africa, to head the World Trade Organization. This is a country of Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. And we've had other great women performing well within Nigeria and beyond Nigeria. So honestly, our challenge is not availability of women with the requisite capacities and competencies. That is not our problem. The problem is the system, is our political structure. So you need to look at the history of our political system. And I would just piggyback a bit on the comments by Okeani said, three of the 13 in the House of Representatives had not sponsored the bill. And I'm like, well, that is showing that about 10 of the women actually did sponsor bills. How many male legislators have not sponsored bills? I think whenever we have conversation around women, we minimize and undermine the quality of conversation by making suggestions that insinuate that women that are in government are not performing, but that is wrong. I think we should look at it from a broad perspective. Let's stop assessing women strictly assessing them with assessment tools that we don't use to assess men. No one is saying, imagine if Nigerians say, after all, men have been leading us for how many years since independence and see where we are. What are we doing with men? We need to get men out of office. Imagine if that was our argument. Because honestly, our system has been led by men for years. We are still struggling. What is this showing? That it's not necessarily about sex. It's about quality of leadership. So when we make our conversations, when we have conversations around women representation, let us stop saying, oh, one woman did this when she was in office. No, that is an unfair assessment. Let us open up the conversation and make it broad. And I bring it down to the political process. We have women contesting elections. In 2019, over 3,000 women contested elections. But out of that number, barely 67 won the elections. Over 3,000 women contested nationally. So it's not that women are not contesting. And not just that. So from the point of aspiration, let us go to the political party process, which is where there's a problem. But while I'm having this conversation, I also want us to also realize that the law itself, what it does, is to address a problem first. It's to make it mandatory for parties to know that, hey, if you don't field women, these seats need to be occupied by women. If we don't field women, the National Assembly would not be constitutional because these seats are yet to be filled by women. So it makes it mandatory for parties to realize that now we need to take conscious effort to include women, not special favors. Women are not asking for favors or privileges. No, we're just asking for an equal and fair playing ground. So why is the party process a challenge? Look at the party primaries.
Affirmative action is a privilege.
Affirmative action is a positive measure introduced to address historic discrimination, not a privilege. It's the same thing as racial conversation around racial discrimination. You're not asking for privilege. You are saying that we're running a race, but these contestants running this race, one of them has been held by chains. And you expect this contestant running with the fellow contestant that had no chains to perform the same way. We're saying no, because of these chains this contestant have, can we ensure that this contestant, these chains are removed so that they can both run on equal footing on the track? So what are we saying? That women have had historic discrimination that have excluded us from the process, both traditional beliefs, religious beliefs, and what have you, and our system of patriarchy. So even in education, you see there are more men that are educated than men. But that does not mean that women are not performing well in education, when given the opportunities. So because of these challenges, affirmative action is introduced to address a historic discrimination for a period of time. If you look at this bill, the proposal is not to end ad infinitum. It's asking for a 16 years review. So after 16 years, for electoral cycle, it will be reviewed to see, have we had an increase? Is there a reduction? What more can we do? Because the system has not been fair to women. From primaries alone, cost of nomination is one major thing. We know that there's a bigger disadvantage for women when it comes to access of office, access of candidate nomination. We have exorbitant fees. We have primaries set in a way that puts women at a discrimination. We have women who experience sexual violence in party primaries that men do not experience.
I want to let you, Cynthia, sorry,
I feel we should have this conversation broadly.
Sorry for interjecting. You say that over 3,000 women contested election.
Yes.
Now that means they have been given an opportunity to contest the election. Now, why didn't they win? Why didn't they win election? And in fact, women most times vote against women. So how sensitized are these women that we are talking about?
Women contesting is not about only women voting. We're not talking about gender from a women issue only. Gender is a national issue. And yes, over 3,000 women did contest the elections as candidates, but which parties were feeling that? So we also need to look at the party system. Remember that in a multi-party democracy, there's a tendency for dominance of two parties. And what we have currently is actually a dominance of two parties. And so within these two parties, what are the access for women within these parties? It's the same thing you talk about youth political participation. We had an increase in young people contesting, but yet, which parties were fielding that? So you need to look at this from that context. But if these parties do not have the mandate to support women candidates, and it's difficult for them to contest. So simply, I will give an example of the ANC in South Africa. ANC has a parity proposals that when they contest, they support men and women. They field equal numbers of male and female candidates. That is why when the ANC wins the election as a ruling party, it increases the number of women in their parliament. But we don't have that here. So it's not that women are allowed to contest or that women are not voting women. No. It's that the parties themselves, if the parties are not supporting women, Go and talk to the women that have won elections, and they will share their experiences with you. Even the men that have contested with them are surprised at some of those the experiences that they share. How many men, when they want to contest for elections, are brought to a meeting with fellow candidates, and they are questioned and asked, how many children do you have? How are you feeding your wife in the house? How are you taking care of your family? No man is asked that question, but we have women. A woman was sharing an experience in the Northwest. She was contested. She was brought in the middle with fellow candidates, and they spoke to her degradingly. Her qualification did not matter. Her exposure did not matter. All they were asking of, who is your father? Who is your husband? How many children do you have? No one was asking, what is the quality you have? So already, psychologically, there were hindrances that affect women emergence. So when I say there's a problem, there is a problem that within our structure, within the party system, that legislative action can help ameliorate.
Yeah, Cynthia, well, thanks. That last point you made, and indeed all the points that you earlier articulated, that legislation might help ameliorate some of these things. I was interested in some of the data you read out with regard to the presence of women in legislatures, say in the northwest zone of the country. You can also extrapolate that to other parts of the country. Kano, 40, no woman. Kaduna, only one, and elsewhere. And I asked the question earlier, if we have the headwinds of culture and social practices still very dominant in our politics, how do you deal with this? Is legislation then going to be a silver bullet, just as Pierre had indicated in terms of caution, of assuming that this will be a magic wand?
It's not a silver bullet, honestly. Like I said, it's a step. What the legislative action does is it guides the process. It helps us begin the process of addressing the challenge of low women representation. Even for countries that introduced them, it took them years to have an increase in number of women. The countries we have mentioned, aside Rwanda, even Senegal, that has parity law, is parity 50-50. They haven't achieved that yet. It's a process. Why? Because of the patriarchal system. So what the legislative process and action does is it makes it mandatory for parties to begin to take action while we begin to do social reorientation, social education, to start promoting women leadership. So it's a step. It's not a silver bullet. It doesn't even answer the question of quality of representation. What it does is it opens up the space so that we can start having fair competition.
Thank you. Cynthia, thanks. Two issues here, just as Kieran is trying to pursue. Two issues here is the process that we are seeking to achieve, or that the bill seeks to achieve, one that should be reduced into provisions in the 1999 Constitution as already amended, or it is one that should be a directive to political parties so that that then becomes a requirement for qualification to contest an election. That's one key point. I think we will return to that presently. But I just wanted us to also consider the moment and then also the future. Cynthia, I was wondering, now the bill seeks an enlargement of the number of seats in the legislature at a time that the country is complaining about the huge cost of governance. I'm wondering, I mean, you know that one of the major issues that we have faced over the past 2 decades has to do, say, at the National Assembly, just how much it's costing the country to continue to have 360 representatives and 109 senators. At some point, there was even a proposal that said, look, why don't you have a single chamber and 2 levels that we're having at the moment? In the meantime, the bill seeks to introduce 111 new members into the National Assembly. And of course, you're also going to have that at the state level. When we are pursuing issues of gender parity, we also must be concerned about the economics of it. The macroeconomic environment is very challenging right now. And even if we were to get out of it in the next couple of years, we have to be concerned about growth, sustainable growth, well above 3%, to outstrip our population growth rate so that we can have a much better life. Is it at this time that we'll be saying, look, okay, what we need now is 111 more seats, or we walk around the current size of the National Assembly and try to get your proportion of women representation from amongst that number? Cynthia.
Very important question. And honestly, in the whole conversation around this bill, this was one major question that kept coming up, the issue on cost of governance. And like you said, can't we work around the existing structure that we have? Being a student of history, we've seen that several assemblies, they've been attempting to work around the existing structure, but it has failed. So this is a proposal that for some reason there is more acceptance for it. So you see over 80 members in the House of Representatives, including the Speaker, sponsoring this bill and serving as co-sponsors of this bill. So we've tried different methods, previous assemblies, it has failed. This is getting the level of support that we need. That is one. The thing on cost of governance, I think the major challenge is citizens are frustrated with the quality. If we had better representation, we wouldn't be talking about the numbers in the House of Reps and in Senate. In 1979, we had 450 seats in the House of Representatives and 5 senators from each state, if you look at the 1979 Constitution, and then we had lesser number of states and lesser population. So if you even look at representation itself, as it is, the problem is not necessarily about the cost, it's the quality. Because if we're spending money the way we should spend it and accounting for every fund, and if we had quality representation, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So I think for me, the focus should be on what do we lose if we don't have women in government? And do we want to sacrifice the interest, or do we want to sacrifice the interest of half of the population? And because of a challenge that they did not cause, can we focus on value of value of money vis-a-vis the quality of representation? That way I think we can then change the conversation, because this is one proposal that has seemed to have gotten the attention of the reps across geopolitical zones in the National Assembly. So maybe we begin this consideration at this point and then focus on demanding for quality representation, focus on accountability, because if we begin to account for funds, if we begin to have quality representation, honestly, Nigerians would not be talking about numbers. They would focus on the value for money and focus on the quality of representation.
Yeah, good quality of representation.
Yeah. Instead of these absolute numbers given here and then ballooning the cost of governance, suppose this were then made a task of political parties by way of legislation to say that for all elections that you'll be feeding candidates, let's say in a general election, 25% minimum, that's 1/4, that's starting with 1/4 of your candidates must be women.
Yeah.
Suppose we did that, so that we monitor and see how it goes. Because if you then feed a candidate, and to the extent that that candidate represents your party, you are obligated to campaign vigorously for that candidate and ensure that the candidate wins. You just say 25%, so that not all this number of saying you want to go and bring 111, you want to go and bring 3 to each candidate, to each state, so that when you are doing 2/3, it becomes a very clumsy arithmetic to work out when you want to get 2/3 votes or 4/5 votes in a particular legislature. Cynthia, what do you think?
Yes, in fact, that had been initial proposals in previous assemblies, asking for 35% representation. So even...
I'm saying 25 now.
Yeah, you're saying 25, but our 25 is low. It's 35%. We're not going lower than that. Yes, so let's just keep it at that. We're even asking for parity, but let's continue. So there's been proposals in previous assemblies, but these have failed. Actually, in the ongoing electoral reform, there was also a proposed amendment to Section 31 of the Electoral Act to mandate parties in their candidate list to have a percentage of women. But the political parties have kicked against that. The lawmakers kicked against that. Why? Because they feel that we've seen that attempts to do this have been kicked against by parties and they've failed. This is the only proposal that so far has received this kind of recognition when it comes to representation in the legislative arm of government. Also, because we practice first past the post, that's the winner takes all system as against proportional representation, it also becomes a bit difficult when you talk about candidate list. So one of the things we've also seen that countries that focused on voluntary party quotas had proportional representation or a mix, which was why Uwe's committee asked for a mix of both first past the post and proportional representation, so that we can also use that to increase representation of women. So there's a lot of that was kicked against
all right,
severally.